All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our latest webinar series titled What Every Executive Should Know. And in this series, we invite industry leaders and experts to have candid conversations about specific projects, topics, challenges they face within their industry. So be sure to follow along. Some previous topics that we've covered in this series that you can check out in our archive on our website include one over data science, another on digital transformation, and our previous one is modern data warehouses. So again, you can check those out on our website. And today we will be covering how to mitigate risk in your data transformation projects. A few housekeeping items. Before we get started, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as a resource that is mentioned during this session will be emailed to you in the next day or so. And additionally, we are having a lightning round at the end of this webinar where our guest speaker will answer rapid fire questions from the audience. So feel free to go ahead and prep any questions you'd like to ask and put them in the chat or Q&A panel that is found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can kind of do that as we go along. And with that, I know we have a jam-packed session, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speakers. Today we have the lovely Susan Schramm, who is the founder of Go-to-Market Impact, a business consultancy that helps CEOs and boards get faster results by optimizing risk of new strategies. Susan spent much of her career leading new initiatives for Fortune 500 companies, from new offerings to IT initiatives to companies and brands. And as a result, she has learned what works and what doesn't, and is here to share with us how we might think about de-risking data transformation. And a fun fact about Susan is that she has personally been to every state in the United States, and no, airports don't count. Susan and her family are also high pointers, working to visit the highest points of altitude in any new city or state they find themselves in, which is so fun. And interviewing Susan today, we have Technion Senior Sales Executive with many years experience around data and analytics in various roles and industries. You could say a true data enthusiast, the great Dave Haas. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to you, Dave.
Wow, amazing introductions. Again, thank you so much, Rachel. Well, hello, everyone. Today we have, I think, what is probably one of the most important topics that we've ever covered. And I'm super excited to have Susan here with us to help us navigate through this discussion around risk. And the way that we first really started thinking about this particular topic was we realized that organizations in general are just struggling with these projects. And surprisingly, most of the time, it really wasn't due to a complexity of a system or perhaps data issues, and those always do come into play. But the real reason and the core behind most of these issues that we found were essentially how people dealt with the risk, right? These are big, huge projects in many, many cases. And sometimes the people side of the equation really wasn't addressed appropriately. So I think one of the things before we introduce Susan and have Susan talk a little bit more about this that I'd love to point you towards is an excellent article. It's in the Harvard Business Review. It's called "Why Is It So Hard to Become a Data-Driven Company?" And Randy Bean kind of goes through and talks through this process that he's been through. He interviews Fortune 1000 companies every year. This year, he had the pleasure of interviewing about 100 companies. And kind of, I'll give you some of the cliff notes, and this was really interesting. What they found was that of the Fortune 1000 companies that were interviewed, only 24% were reporting being actually data-driven, which is surprising because the prior year, when this survey was actually done, the number was 38%. So there's a pretty significant decrease in companies in C-level executives claiming that their company actually is data-driven. The other big thing that this article talks about was the cultural challenges that were experienced. And one of the results that comes back is that actually 92% of the folks that were interviewed that expressed concerns and challenges that they were experiencing whereas because of cultural versus data or technical issues. So with that, Susan, this is such a huge topic. I'm going to turn it over to you. Where do you want to start? How should we start this discussion about risk?
So let's just start with the word risk, because everything you just said sounds like challenge. So I'm going to have a little bit of audience participation here. When
All right.
you think, this is an emotional subject, actually, because at the end of the day, risk is not a technology. I mean, technology has risk, but the emotional implications of risk can be high. So type into the chat the word that comes to mind when you, or you, David, you can say it too, that when you think about risk, what word comes to mind? Word association.
I mean, right off the bat, while people are chatting in, I'll throw a couple out. I think expensive.
Incorrect.
I think hazardous. I think danger. All kind of words that kind of come to mind right out of the gate.
Oh, wow. And look at the security, if I wasted money, unknown, stress.
Stress is a good one. Let's actually write that one down.
That's exactly true. So what's interesting about this, when we let's tackle the subject of risk proactively, because that is, if you take one idea away from today, my point of view is that risk is not something you wait for, it's something you proactively plan for. And that there's two sides of risk, okay? There is two, one is the loss of assets. And that's where you talked about data, you talked about cost, you talk about loss of life in some applications that are really mission critical. I mean, there's a loss of value because of things that you have to protect. And so when you're managing risk of loss of value, it's all about protecting and putting fences around things and planning for that. But there's another part of risk that people often miss planning for, which is creating value. And this is windows of opportunity. This is creating risk reward. This is ROI. And so creating value is the right-hand side, David. And the points that I think you think about in that are going to be different, because think of a fireman walking into a fire. He's taking risk, but there's a reward at the other end. Think of all the people who did research and spent a lot of money developing new drugs to allow us to protect the world from COVID. Think about CEOs who place a flag in a new market, and they're planning a lot of money, time, and energy, and they want to create return, and that is a new market risk. So both sides of this are important to plan for, because what you do when you're protecting value tends to be more cautious. Everything about creating value a lot of times is windows of opportunity. It's speed to adoption. So in that sense, there's an element of not just slowing down to protect, but speeding up and being very aware of what the opportunities are that might pass you by. So does that make sense? Is that a good place to start?
I love it. I love it. I've never thought about the opposite side. All of the words, right? Did most of the words that come through were all on the loss of value side?
Yeah, tended to be about loss. It's normal. And by the way, that's where most companies, when they have, that there's a risk, there's been a disruption in the world of risk management, because so much it's slowed down organizations. There was another Harvard Business Review article about essentially the lack of agility of companies because of risk. Well, what they're talking about is risk of loss, not risk of creating value, in which case it's speeding up the company to seize that risk. Okay, so that's a good place to start.
Awesome. Well, one of the things, Susan, that I always associate or started to associate with any kind of risk or change in a market is the classic technology adoption curve, Jeffrey Moore's curve, right? And I know all of you on here probably have seen it, but I'll just draw it again. You've got, your innovators on this side and on the left side. You've got your laggards, right? Folks that don't want to change on this side. And then on this side right here, you have this area that he refers to as the chasm. Mm-hmm. So talk to us a little bit about this, Susan. What are you?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Every one of you, if you've been involved in any project, and it sounds like you've been involved in lots, that behavioral issue of, first of all, you've got the new. This really applies, by the way. Moore was really talking about scenarios where people had to do something differently. Like if you don't,
Mhm.
if your behavior doesn't have to change, this doesn't necessarily apply. But if it does have to change, if processes have to change, if your knowledge of how you apply information has to change, this is really appropriate. So what the deal is, that first group is actually fun and easy and loud and exciting. But then there's this like, oh my gosh, most of your return on investment is on the right when you get people repeatedly growing the market and doing more of it. What he
Oh,
said,
so the range should be on the right.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's where your profit usually is. You don't make
right,
money
right.
on the left-hand side. You make money on the right-hand side. Or if it's a social impact, you know, that first is your proof points, but the right is when you actually create broad impact. So
Mm.
he proposes to create what he calls a bandwagon effect. The idea of leveraging each group along the way to persuade the next one. So essentially you get momentum and cross the chasm by intentionally knowing this is going to happen and intentionally planning for people in your early adopters who can relate to the people on the right in different ways, whether it's the same industry or the same demographic or whatever. So they may be early adopters by behavior, but when it comes to helping them help you get to the right, they've got some way to relate to that next group of people, and you can leverage that and create momentum. But you know, Dave, that's all about the technology, looking at the technology adoption. I'd like to suggest when HBR talked about the problem, they talked about something called culture, right? Culture is primarily made of humans, right? So why don't we look at the human adoption curve, okay? And this was really expanded by behavioral science scientist William Bridges. He talked about it in a book called Transition, where he talked about how every human, when they confront change, has to deal with this valley that they're going into. And change is something that happens to you. Even if you don't agree with it, right? It could be a reorganization, it could be a new regulation. Oh, it could be an introduction of new tools and processes to leverage data in new ways. It could be any of those things. Those are changes. Transition, on the other hand, is the journey we go through in our minds as we deal with that change. So change can happen really quick, but transition takes more time. And Bridget talks about 3 phases. The first is letting go of the old. They fear what they don't understand. There's risk that they're going to look stupid. There's this, whether they're angry or frustrated or embarrassed, there's this, I don't want to go to this new space. Then, interestingly enough, there's a neutral zone. And actually, that's the first point where they might be able to actually hear you a little bit, because that's when they're actually maybe in a model where they acknowledge that this new thing, this new system, this new way of working is going to come. They still may be skeptical, but at least they're acknowledging it and evaluating it. The last step is what would be for all of us a new beginning, when you are ready to listen and build skills and work in a new way. And at that point, emotionally, you tend to feel relief because you've gone past that part in the middle. But at that point is when you really can create vast adoption. So if in a way, Dave, we could take this human curve, and inside every one of those stages, you'd have that human beings going through, you know, the Moore's adoption curve is all about the technology itself being adopted. But inside that, when you think of the people you need to do something new, they're all going through that human adoption curve.
I love it. So it's, you know, if you overlaid the Moore's curve, right? You've got this chasm in here. Your transition actually happens after you cross the chasm.
Yeah. Well,
so that's
person, right? That human is going through that. Exactly. So even the early adopters have to go through this. They just are faster to get through that transition into new. Whereas the other folks take a lot longer on the letting go, and then you go through it. So knowing that about these humans you have to deal with is really important to think through.
Well, so Susan, here's a term that you use. It's called derisking.
Yeah.
You talk to us a little bit about what derisking is all about.
Well, yeah, my point of view is strong, is that you really don't have a choice. If you want to create a result, you have to plan for the risk, as I said. And so some people talk about de-risking in terms of eliminating risk, and that is not possible. Risk is a constant. De-risk is an intentional and systematic process to identify and optimize risk in order to achieve a desired outcome and enable you to lead with more confidence. But it's the idea of an intentional. The word systematic is really key here. I find a lot of organizations don't have a very systematic approach. Even if they have a decent new product introduction process, they upfront will do a little bit of a SWOT analysis kind of thing, but they don't have a rhythm of reviewing the risks. And often it's dealt with ad hoc, or it's late. Risk tends to creep up on people and surprise us. And then culturally, many leaders don't even like to talk about risk. Somehow they feel like if you're going to talk about risk, you're not bought in. So instead, if you have that kind of environment where a leader just like, hey, listen, get on the train, we're leaving. If you're not part of this, you're not involved, right? Well, people still feel the risk and they worry in their heads. Back to their point about stress, right? That's where anxiety happens, because you're sitting there worried that something's going to happen either to you, to your organization, to your project, to your company, to the users, and there's no plan to address it. So that's a really important part. And the only thing is, you're not going to eliminate risk, you're going to optimize it. So that means your process has to regularly review it and see not only like, how are you protecting, but how are you quickly scanning the environment to make sure that you're going to be able to move quickly if things change. So it's not scary. It's something to be planned for.
I love that you talk about how risk it's going to be there. There's no avoiding it for these big projects. You just have to embrace it almost.
Right.
And
in fact,
it's just systematic.
Yeah, embrace. I mean, it sounds a little corny to embrace risk, but I think that what people might say in a professional organizational world is proactively proactively plan for a return on investment by identifying and mitigating risk, but optimizing risk to make sure that you're able to see windows of opportunity.
I love it. And it goes back to the very first part of our session today when you talked about not only the loss, but the value created. Okay. So Susan, what are some of the common mistakes that people make when they launch new strategies?
Well, this is how I build my company. So I've got lots of them, but let me just choose a couple that
Sure.
you guys might immediately see and be able to apply. So, but I am going to give this little warning. Some of this sounds deceptively simple, but what's interesting, after all the work I've done myself in launching and all the organizations I'm doing research with and serving as clients, different sizes, different industries, nonprofit and for-profit, here's the deal. If you don't take advantage of avoiding these common mistakes, you will waste money, energy, and time. And even if you do launch on time, you're going to get stalled and you're definitely going to be frustrated. So with that, here's the first one. Focusing on what instead of why. And so, I spent most of my career in tech, and we love cool what's, our shiny solutions. We put a lot of money, time, and energy into our cool tech and analytics, right? But often the why is not clearly understood. And when I talk about why, it means, what business problem are you solving? So the business problem is not data. That's not the business problem. The business problem has to do with the outcome you're creating. So according to ChangePoint, 80% of project executives don't know how their project aligns with a company's business strategy. You got to know the strategy, because as you go along, you're going to have to link these choices of tools and solutions to that strategy. And the strategy itself may have a lot of unknowns too. So being clearly, tightly aligned with that. It's also an interesting one is they know why they're doing it, but they don't know why it's important right now. What's the windows of opportunity they have to make, or they'll miss it. So being really clear on why and why now is real important. So when I talk about an example in the world of data transformation about what we're talking about, you'd be like, if you're a hospital, your why is to lower the number of patients that return to the hospital after they've had surgery. Or if you're a city government and your why is to be absolutely sure you're delivering your citizens the highest level of quality. Or you're an association and your why is to deeply understand the interests and concerns of your members to ensure your research is relevant, or your policy regulation. Or if you're a trucking firm and your why is to keep your fleet on the road, serving customers, but minimizing the amount of time your drivers are having to take a time off due to maintenance. So those are business reasons. The data transformation projects have to support it. And if you skip this, what happens is, number one, the project, when you go to get people to take action, they're not bought in. They don't see it as relevant. So it's a language to help your project relate to their priorities. You'll also, if you're not clear of this, you don't know how to make trade-offs. If your project runs into bumps along the road because you don't know how it fundamentally relates to the business priority, you don't know how to make choices and reframe. Lots of time and money can be spent with no outcomes, and you can accidentally miss important windows of opportunity because you didn't know what those business implications were. You may be chugging along with your own timetable and not realize that you have just missed a big opportunity. So that's my first call to action. Ask yourself, to avoid this common mistake, ask yourself, are you personally fundamentally clear on the business purpose of your project and the problem you're solving? How will you know it's solved, and why is it important to solve it now? Make sense, Dave?
It does. It does. You know, it's interesting. In last month's webinar, when we interviewed Michael Tantrum about data transformation projects, and we covered some of the more technical reasons that projects fail, but he talked about the real killer of most of these projects being when you don't have executive sponsorship aligned on your project. And an executive sponsor would be someone that is going to go to bat for you, that can marshal the resources that you need, can get you the budget that you need. I mean, that's just critically important in mitigating risk. Is that something you're seeing in your project?
Yeah, because I remember that he talked about the kill zone. He said
yes,
this project is in the kill zone because it's going to be dead quickly if you don't have that. But I would just like to warn one thing. I've seen scenarios where you've got a great executive sponsor who really believes in this, but they believe in the tools. They themselves haven't clearly defined the business problem to be solved because they're excited about this new thing. They're frustrated because whatever they were doing is not working. So their answers is, oh, it's got to be, we need better reporting, or we need better visualization, or we need information for these people. But getting why clear along with the outcomes you're striving for is really important. So even if you have an executive sponsor, it'd be great for you to spend an hour with that person translating that call to action that he sees or she sees into the consequences for the organization if you achieve it, and if you don't, how will we measure it? How will other functions see this as important? Because otherwise, everybody just gets excited with excited projects, and when priorities shift, like suddenly there's a big customer loss or a pandemic, suddenly that project is lost because it's not it's not clear what the business outcome is that you would lose if you drop it.
Right. And just so everyone that didn't get a chance to hear Michael at the last one, what Susan's referring to is Michael drew an iceberg, and here you are on your boat, right, sailing along happily, and you can see the dangers and the risks at the top, but there are underlying issues and problems, and this kill zone area right at the bottom is what Michael was referring to. That'll really sink your project. Susan, let's skip ahead a little bit and talk about planning to de-risk. Walk me through that.
Okay, well, what we do is we take you systematically through. Here's the thing: is my guidance to people is to systematically start up front, either 2 points in time when you need to plan for risk. Number one, before you ever launch. It's like the luxurious time when you're building a house and you can sit there with the blueprints and you have this, you don't have to waste money moving walls because you can proactively see what that would do, right? The other time is when you're stuck. And when people are stuck, they're scared and they're frustrated. And at that point in time, it's really important to back up, step away from the car, be strategic, and think through what are the risks at this point and how can we mitigate them. And in many cases, I have helped people by walking through a set of principles that I call the Derisk or system impact, where essentially you've got six different dimensions of what you need to do to address risk. And in doing that, what you end up doing is they're not complicated. It's things like beyond why, it's who has to take action right now to make this successful. It's the issue of why why do people believe this solution is going to be the right one? And or have you made it really clear? The one thing I would say that I don't want to miss is that when it comes to who we want to move to action, we need to anticipate the issue of the brain. Believe it or not, brain science is going to help you here. A lot of times the biggest impediment to you moving forward is all about getting people to do something new. And what is interesting is if you were to take a picture of the brain, Dave's drawing it from the top, like there's old brain and new brain, they call it, or the neocortex is the outside brain and the limbic is in the middle. And what's interesting about it is in the neocortex is where all the data and information, rational thinking is. But the limbic at the base is where your fight or flight is. It's where your emotion is. It is also where your decision making is. And this is to protect you. But if you don't necessarily plan for the information you're going to need to do to spur both the outside brain to know what the information is that they need to take action on, but also why they need to, you are going to miss opportunities. And it sort of ties back to the human adoption process. But, when you go to launching, intentionally thinking about what you can do to do both. For instance, on the outside part, clearly you got a lot of data, you got a lot of good information about why the impact will be, and you can have all sorts of charts. But if you don't say, what's the personal impact of this person who has to take action, whether it's, ability to have less work or its ability to make decisions so that they look smarter to people, something where you're planning for the people. And lots of times your storytelling really comes into play here. Your storytelling really can help both sides of the brain of the people you're trying to identify to take action respond better to the outcomes. Is that getting too scientific for you there, Dave?
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. So just to maximize our time together, Susan, let's skip down a little bit to talk to me about how your firm applies your systematic process to de-risk new strategies, and kind of talk a little bit about how the process actually works, and perhaps give us some of the things that we can take away.
Yeah, well, I'd say here's the process. It's something it takes weeks, not years. You step back and identify this. If you want to learn more, you can go to my website, go to marketimpact.com. And basically what we do is we systematically shorten the time it takes for an organization to think through these very basic ideas, but do it in a way that you're all the way along, you're documenting risks and assumptions. Because a lot of times you're making assumptions and you don't have all the information. And so the first part is identifying the risk. The second is preparing for how to address those risks. And the third, to be honestly, is putting a plan in place for ongoing management, because a lot of times this is done once. Many new product introduction processes do this once, but having a rhythm for scanning for change and reviewing what those risks are is part of the process.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, so how can we learn more? You mentioned your website. I think you also have something to give us at the end of this.
Anybody who registered will get the notes of my comments and some thoughts about specific questions you could ask yourselves or your team to make sure you've identified risk and have a plan for it.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. Well, I'd like to move now towards the lightning round of questions and encourage anyone out in the audience to go ahead and submit some questions to us, and Susan will gladly answer those. I have one just to kind of get things rolling for us. The first one for you, Susan, is what can I do to start the conversation about risk if I'm not the leader?
Yeah, okay. And by the way, I see Jeff's comment about I only gave one common mistake. So I'll incorporate the answers to this second common mistake in some of these examples. So the first thing I want to say is, even if you're not the boss, like even if you're not the CEO or the board or the head of the project, you can create an environment where people can talk about risk. Here's an idea. at your next staff meeting or team meeting, play an exercise called play the movie backwards. And essentially you take your launch and you say it's 2 years out and you're watching the movie, how it went perfectly. And you say, what was it? And you play it backwards and say, where along the movie was there's this plot twist that we did exactly the right thing. And I'm saying start with that because people will actually quickly go to the next part, which is, oh my God, there's plot twists where you don't do the right thing. And if all you did as a group was simply, put together the list of the things that come to mind, that if these things don't happen, there's a consequence, you'll find they really do relate a lot to the categories that I've framed here. The second thing I think is this idea, and this is the second common mistake, is who. There's a tendency with new initiatives to focus on the regular people you think of. That, okay, we have a new opportunity for sales, and so we're gonna get this tool ready for the sales team. Okay, great. Who else needs to know this to be able to take action? Who else might be implicated? It's interesting because and why would they, by the way, why would they take action? Back to the brain and the science behind it. Well, what's interesting is there's a lot of unexpected people who have an impact. What I find very often is if you're launching a new way of doing business, the front line is not just the salespeople pitching it, but it's the accounting department. So if someone calls into accounting and they go, I'm trying to get my bill done or whatever, and they go, I don't know anything. I'm a mushroom sitting here. They never tell me this stuff. So the idea of channel partners and suppliers who might need to know what your strategy is a way to frame who needs to do what to take action. That's an approach.
Awesome. So we have some questions here, Susan. Anna Marie is asking, how important is it to align the decision makers with the change makers? And she says she's a supplier diversity, and this is what we miss.
It's interesting because in Built to Last, Jim Collins said that a new visionary strategy is 1% vision and 99% alignment. And, and as I say, even great strategies will fail if people don't get aligned to execute. And even so strategies will be excellent because people all know what's going on. So how important into it is critical. The question comes down to, how do you know they're not? And that's why sometimes not talking about it is the quickest way to assure that you won't be aligned. If you're not willing to talk about the risks, you will assure that they aren't aligned. And one of the things that we do in these workshops is we actually take diverse groups of people and walk through the how, let's play the movie backwards kind of thing, with diverse groups. And we actually create a safe place for people to talk about what they're worried about. And in supplier diversity, it's a very important goal, but it always isn't understood when it comes to finance. Like, why are we doing this if it's going to cost us more money? Or in some cases, data, I did a survey just the other day, a focus group, where we had two different reactions. Executives talking about digital transformation saying this is all being driven by vendors and IT departments. I don't see why this is really relevant to us. And then you've got IT departments people frustrated because they're like, all we want to do is do this for the business, but we can't get anybody to work with us. Well, what's that? That's a lack of alignment. And in many cases, the exercise that you need to go through is simply giving a safe place to talk about risk, so it's not personal. Because a lot of people don't want to talk about it. They think they look like a Debbie Downer, or they look like they're not loyal, or they don't get the picture. But in fact, in their mind, they're like, this is on a path to crash. So that's what I do: create a safe space for people to talk about risk, and then get the different perspectives in the room, and then keep it going. Don't have that be a one-time shot.
Awesome. Susan, here's another one. Is there a way to measure the success of a de-risking program?
It's interesting because, here I am saying you need to have a way to measure the success of your initiative, right? How are you going to measure a business problem that you're solving? It's interesting because the success of a de-risking has both a business and a human impact. So when it comes to the business impact, a lot of it is time to market. It's time to results, whether that's the whether that's the on time, on budget metric, right? It could be speed to market for a new launch. It could be speed to funding. If a lot of what you're doing is trying to get other people, if you have clarity that you're making progress. One thing I found when I was on boards or in positions of funding new projects, people would come into me and go, we need money for this. It's so important. And all I could do in my brain was go like, this is, where is it going to fail? So if you can systematically have identified those weak points and be able to say clearly, here's the areas that are our biggest risk and here's how we're managing it, you actually give calm and you get more people interested in funding the project. But there's a second part, which is the people. And like we talked a lot about culture and people. Some metric is employee engagement. Another is retention of the team. People quit when they feel like this is going down, right? So you get, whether it's employees or people who are volunteers within a company who are supposed to be on the team, or volunteers in a nonprofit. In that environment, getting people to stay engaged and stay with the project is an easy metric. And the other one would be leads. Like if you get people being willing to give you leads because they know what you're doing and the business problem you're solving, it's a lot easier for them. Oh, you're solving this problem by when? Because it's important now. Got it. And so you can actually track that to leads. Does those make sense for a business environment for you, David?
It does. All right, Susan, one more for you. Do you have a client that you've helped out of a bad situation by mitigating risk?
Yeah, let's talk about one that's, well, I have two, but with time, let's go to this first one. Is very much like what many of you are doing here. Scenario where a company was launching a multi-million-dollar product launch where they were taking an on-prem solution to a cloud. And so we worked with the team to systematically identify who has to take action. We got a cross-functional team to essentially walk the process, do the movie. Not only at launch, but we said, okay, it's 2 years out, what's going wrong? They realized that profitability, when you go from on-prem to a by the seat subscription, is all about growth and renewals of users. But when we went through the process of we identified a big risk. Renewals were going to be based on people using it and their trust and belief that this was a solution, not just because the buying department, procurement, or whoever the boss was told them, but because they personally did. And what we realized was, because we looked at cases today, a lot of organizations, whether it's post-COVID or downsizing or people changing jobs, there's a lot of turnover. So because there was turnover, these people who trusted and believed as new users weren't necessarily going to be there to continue to use it. And a new person walking in didn't really have that belief that was there at the original launch. So as a result, to de-risk this program, we changed the whole sales and onboarding process to create mentor support for users, no matter when they came on board, not just here's the online thing, but a place to go and a person to have some touch points. And we also identified early notification of low use because they were at risk. So that's one example. Make sense?
It does. Rachel, I think we've got everything lined up as far as all the content. I don't see any other questions. Did you see anything else come in?
I think that's it. And with the time today, I think that's all we have time for. But thank you so much, Susan and Dave, for your time. We hope that you guys enjoyed today's session. I'm going to throw up a quick poll if you guys wouldn't mind taking just a few seconds to answer this poll. Your feedback is invaluable as we continue to plan the series and find wonderful speakers like Susan. And again, reminder, today's session was recorded, and the recording as well as Susan's notes that she mentioned will be emailed to you in the next day or so. And again, thank you for joining us, and feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions you may have, and we hope to see you guys again next time.
Nice to meet you. Talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.